Hello. I'm a man in my early 50s. Oftentimes, when I talk with other people, I hear things like, "Wow, I can't believe it. How did you handle that?" No one I've ever talked to has been through the things I have. No one even believes me when I tell them about my story. It's hard to imagine what something is truly like if you've never experienced it before. In my case, very, very few people have ever been through what I have. I'd like to tell you the full truth of what happened to me. I hope you can put yourself in my shoes and imagine what it was like for me. I'll start my story by giving you some background. I'm a physician working in a hospital. To be honest, I was always pretty bright. I always got good grades. Because of that, I got a respectable job and even got married. Well, I should make myself clear. I married a girl who I had been dating through college. Her name was Hannah. I didn't have the courage to ever break up with her, so eventually we ended up getting married. I'd be lying if I said we got married because we were madly in love with each other. It wasn't that type of marriage. It was more of a, "Oh no, you're pregnant. We have to get married" type of marriage. I didn't want to abandon her once she found out she was having a child. It would have potentially ruined her life, and I didn't want that on my conscience. So we ended up having shotgun wedding. It was clear right away my parents didn't like her. They didn't think she was a good fit for me. They knew she didn't come from a good family. She didn't have a respectable job. She wasn't making good money. She was just an average office worker with a below-average salary. There were a handful of times she left my house crying after visiting. I'd always come to my wife's defense when my mother would say something to cross the line. We had little blowouts every so often over it. As time went on, I got older, and my mother got more and more frail. She didn't have the fire she used to have inside of her. I think my wife's voice grew louder and more shrill with age. We had our first and only daughter named Kendall. Before I knew it, she was already starting middle school. I worked long hours at the hospital to support my family. I was doing everything I could to provide for them. My wife worked equally as hard at home, raising our daughter and looking after the house. We lived a simple life, or at least tried to. Sometimes my wife would go out with some of the other wives from the hospital. She liked golfing. She was halfway decent at it too. I was terrible, so I never went to play with her. I personally liked hiking. I'd go out on the trails and take pictures. I liked nature photography. Our personalities were a little different too. She liked being around a lot of people at a time. I liked being alone or maybe being with one other person. Any more than that, and I'd get social anxiety. That was the extent of our differences. It never caused any friction between us, luckily. Even for average people, we were average. We led normal lives, and we were happy with that. As the years went on, that happiness slowly started to fade away, and my wife and I grew more and more distant. The root of it was my relationship with my wife's family. She comes from a huge family. She has a lot of siblings. I actually had no idea about that until after we were married. She was the oldest. She had 4 younger brothers and 5 younger sisters. They were known to cause problems. I inherited those problems. Now they were technically my family. I'll spare you the specifics of their issues. I honestly don't think there's enough time in the day to go over all the trouble they cause. They never had any money growing up and still didn't. They'd somehow always get my wife tangled up in whatever mess they made. It became my responsibility to dish out the money to fix their problems. Being a physician meant I had a decent salary, but that doesn't mean I could afford to constantly give handouts to them. Sometimes it wasn't even about the money. I didn't have the time to fix their mistakes. I would work around the clock. Even when my shift ended, I attended conferences and meetings with my colleagues. I barely had a second to myself to relax, let alone worry about them. Being a doctor is exactly as busy as you'd imagine. All day, I thought about going home and sleeping in my own bed. But that wasn't my reality. I wanted to get home and be greeted by my beautiful daughter. I wanted to walk into the kitchen to the smell of my wife's delicious cooking. I wanted to sit down, loosen my tie, and have my wife massage my shoulders. None of those things ever happened. Instead, when the moment I went home, I'd see my wife sitting at the kitchen table, where she'd tell me my brother got into trouble again. What are we gonna do? That was my reality. As soon as I heard the word might come out of my wife's mouth, I could feel a cold wave of pain spreading through my head. If things just ended by me handing over money, I wouldn't be here talking with you. It wasn't that simple. There are some problems money can't fix. This is one of them. As I explained before, I was nothing more than an am they'd use when they ran into trouble. That was the relationship I had with them. I never met with them or spent time with them outside of giving them money. One day I felt under the weather. I had been having stomach discomfort, so I went to get it checked out. I had an endoscopic examination, and I was diagnosed with a stomach ulcer. People these days are commonly diagnosed with a variety of stomach problems like fatty liver or stomach inflammation. A stomach ulcer can cause extreme discomfort in the patient. It's something many people have experienced. The symptoms can be debilitating, so it's important for the person suffering from it to receive the necessary support and care from their family if possible. After the examination, I went back to an empty house. My daughter was out playing with her friends and my wife wasn't home. I prepared myself a meal and sat down to eat when my wife came home. She was wearing her golfing outfit. When I asked her where she'd been, she said, "I played a few holes with the hospital director's wife." I figured that much by taking one look at her. They'd become quite friendly with one another recently. The hospital director's wife took a liking to her. I was glad to hear that. I wasn't glad to hear what she had to say next. I told her about my stomach ulcer. I said I'd probably need to be admitted into the hospital for treatment. I said there was a chance my condition could worsen. My wife listened as if I were telling her what I had for breakfast, in a completely disinterested tone. She said, "Okay. And you'll go to your hospital, right? The nurses there are good. They'll take care of you. I'm exhausted. I'm going upstairs and gonna go to sleep." Her lack of care really hurt me. Our marriage was on the rocks. I never desired to have the kind of marriage you see on TV. Unconditional love that makes you all warm and fuzzy inside. But at the very least, I was hoping when I told my family my health issue, they'd worry about me. I don't think that's unreasonable to ask for. My wife's indifferent attitude towards me weighed down on my emotions. It didn't sit right with me. I had to speak my mind. What am I to you? Just a machine works and works to support this family. Or am I just an atom to fix all the mess your family gets itself into? I can't believe how you've changed. You care more about going to play golf than my health. Your priorities are completely backwards. What's the point of me working this hard if you're just going to treat me like this? What do you have to say for yourself? I thought my wife would apologize. I was pretty worked up. Instead, she just stared at me and started to laugh. She tried to play it off like I was being ridiculous. Wow. You need a drink or something to calm yourself down. Go to sleep if you're going to be this cranky. Like I said, I'm tired. I'm going to take a shower, then go to sleep. That was the moment when the love for my wife completely faded. Since that day, my wife and I barely spoke. Eventually, there was an incident which led to us living separately. She loaned her family a huge sum of money. She did it behind my back. Apparently, she put a down payment on a house out in the countryside for them. They decided they all wanted a cabin they could all share and stay at for the summer. One of her siblings was even planning to live there eventually after they retired. I found out about this and went over to try and see if there was anything I could take back the money she gave them. I made myself as clear as possible. They needed to return that money to me because she had no right to give it to them. Instead of apologizing, they thought I was overreacting and were annoyed I was asking for the money back. If it wasn't illegal, I would have beaten every one of them with my bare hands. I held myself back. What would my daughter think if her dad went to jail for fighting her aunts and uncles? In the end, I decided this was the final straw and that I would be living apart from my wife from that day on. I felt bad for my daughter. She was at the age where she knew what was going on, but still was too young to know how to handle it on her own. She sat and watched silently as the emotional distance between her parents grew miles apart. The day came for me to move out. I had my bags packed and ready to go at the front door. Before I left for good, my wife drove one final nail into my coffin. She told me divorce is out of the question. You'll need to pay me for child support too. Everything was about money to her, even in the end. In that moment, I wanted to slam my wife's head against the wall. I'm generally an optimist, so I tried to find the silver lining in this situation. I loved my daughter, so I didn't mind sending money for her. This was actually the best-case scenario financially. The only money of mine my wife could get her hands on was the money I sent her. She had no way of taking any more from me. I leased a studio apartment near my hospital and started life on my own. It physically pained me to send my wife any money at all. But I knew it was for my daughter, so it put me a bit at ease. Also, as much as I hated her, I personally feel women have more aptitude when it comes to raising children. Plus, it may be better for a daughter to have her mother around. I think it was a better outcome than my wife being the one who left. I figured my wife was satisfied. She was getting money from me and didn't have to be in the same house with me. That's why she didn't want a divorce. I had to decide if that was the best way to move forward or not. Before I knew it, a year had passed since I started living on my own, and I was too preoccupied to think about much else but my job. Work was extremely busy, and I started getting treatment for my stomach condition. Even though my wife and I were living separately, I still got to see my daughter every once in a while. When I'd go over there, my wife would pop in the room while my daughter and I were together. I'd always be sure to keep things civil for my daughter's sake. It may have just been my imagination, but I felt like things between my wife and I started to get a little better. Maybe it was one of those you don't know what you had until it's gone type things. Maybe her idea about how things would be was different than how they actually were, and she realized. I always valued family, but now more than ever. I thought maybe she felt the same way, even if it wasn't to the same extent as me. I was foolish to think she'd changed, though. I should have known that people can't truly change the way they are. No matter how things seemed or how she made things seem, she never actually changed at all. One day I got a text from her saying she wanted to see me. I suggested we go to the cafe in my hospital where we used to meet up with each other often. Instead, she said she wanted to meet somewhere quiet. She preferred to meet somewhere outside like a park. To be honest, I didn't feel comfortable in places I wasn't normally in. I didn't like being around other people as it is, especially if it was somewhere new and I didn't know anyone. I had a bit of social anxiety. I liked meeting in the hospital because it was a familiar environment, and I don't know. I just felt more at ease there. I agreed to meet her where she wanted. When I got there, she took a manila envelope out of her bag and took out some documents. My heart was racing. I asked her if that was what I thought it was, and she said yes. I said, "Why now?" What changed all of a sudden? Things have felt less draining the past year that we've been apart. I realized how important family is, and I got the impression you felt the same. You haven't felt any of that. She stared down at the papers and said nothing. I continued. Is there another man? She remained silent. Don't just sit there and say nothing. I have a right to know what's going through your head right now. If you're with someone else, does Kendall know about it? She finally spoke. There's no one else. Being with you is just too much of a burden. I didn't know how to respond. I told her I wanted to think about it, and I did. Is getting divorced like this really the answer? Is living separately still the best thing to be doing? A million thoughts were running through my head. If we get divorced, what will happen to our daughter? That was the biggest problem on my mind. My parents actually suggested divorce a while back. I was in my early 50s, but I obviously had a good job. It wouldn't be impossible to get remarried at this age. I wasn't really concerned about remarriage, though. To be honest, I didn't think it was going to happen even if I did get divorced. I had no problem with keeping things the way they were. I could still see my daughter and my wife, but the stress my wife was feeling from me being there all the time wouldn't be an issue like it was before. I knew my wife wasn't going to change her mind. I had no choice but prepare myself for potentially getting a divorce. A few nights later, I went out to a bar with a good friend of mine. He knows all about my family situation. I told him there was a very good possibility I could get a divorce. He said he thought it was a good idea and that I should get it over with ASAP. "You're only going to make things worse if you drag it out," he said. He was right. After talking with him, I thought it was probably the right choice to break things off with my wife. We ordered a bottle of top-shelf whiskey and sat at the bar until the bottle was nearly gone. I think any man can relate. There's no problem you can't solve with some alcohol and a good friend. That night, it felt like we were kids again. Not a care in the world, laughing and having the time of our lives. The next morning was a different story. My head felt like someone split it open with an axe. I woke up to a text from my friend. "Your new life starts today. You're the man. Forget the past." I mustered the strength to get out of bed and go to the hospital. That night, I remember I had an emergency call that I had to attend to. I wouldn't normally get assigned to something like this, but recently we were tight on staff. The doctor who's usually in charge of emergency arrivals was off that night. I was there in his place. When an ambulance rushes up to the ER doors, you never really know what you're going to be dealing with. It was a pretty quiet night. There were no patients in the hospital and no visits. As a doctor, that was a good thing. Everyone was staying safe and healthy. Since it was pretty slow that night, I decided to lay down in a bed in the on-call room. I woke up to an emergency call. It was for a patient who had been in a traffic accident and was being transported via ambulance. It was a woman in her 40s. I looked at the patient's chart as I rushed down the stairs. She had received initial treatment by the paramedics who arrived on the scene of the accident. According to them, she was in a stable condition but with an injury. My mind was a little more at ease knowing her condition wasn't life-threatening. I made my way to her bed. When I pulled back the curtain and saw who was lying there, I nearly dropped to the floor. There she was, wearing designer clothes and decked out in expensive jewelry. It was my wife. It was her, screaming in pain right before my very eyes. Where was she going at this hour looking like that? Her legs were in pretty bad shape from the accident. This was the first time seeing my wife in any of those clothes. Where and when did she get all of this expensive stuff? I had no time to focus on what she was wearing. My first priority was assessing her condition. There was a lot of blood on her clothes and in her bed. Immediately, I called for her to be given a sedative as I had the emergency responder read to me what happened to cause the accident. It was confirmed that she was involved in a car accident with another vehicle and she sustained a substantial leg injury. Next, I had to visually assess the injuries my wife had. This means she had to either take off her pants or I'd need to cut them off. There was too much blood and was making her pants stick to her leg, though. I had no choice but to cut them. I knew she wouldn't be happy because they looked really expensive. I wanted to get my wife's consent before I ruined her clothes. As she was writhing in pain, she told me, "Don't come near my clothes with those scissors." A nurse I was with recognized her. She asked, "Isn't that your wife?" I didn't bother responding to a question she already knew the answer to. I said, "Listen to me. I need to assess your wounds. There's too much blood which is making it difficult to see the extent of your injury. Your pants are sticking to your leg. I have to cut them off." My wife let out a huge scream in protest. "Take me to another hospital. Don't touch me." There was a chance she could lose consciousness from the amount of blood she lost, and yet she had the energy to scream like that. It was hard for me to process everything that was going on. I told her if you don't receive treatment immediately, you're at risk to have permanent damage. I don't actually need your permission to do this. I'm asking just to be considerate. Are your clothes more important than your life? I think the pain finally got to her. She nodded her head and let out a faint whine. I used the shears to cut her pants and assess her injury. I gasped, and it wasn't from the injury. Now I knew why she was saying she wanted to go to another hospital. She didn't want to show me her lower body. As I cut her pants, I saw that she had a tattoo that said Hat 3S. I was at a loss for words. I didn't have time to dwell on that, though. I had to treat her. She was sent in for emergency surgery. A few hours later, I went to her room to check on her. Around then, her mother and father arrived at the hospital. I let her mother know that Hannah was in stable condition. She cried and thanked me for taking care of her. She then tried to change my mind about the way things had become. She asked me if there was any chance Hannah and I could fix our marriage. She was under the impression that I had done something that caused me to be kicked out of the house and live separately from Hannah. I thought it would be pointless to explain what was really going on to her. I didn't. And I didn't answer her about getting back together with Hannah either. They left the hospital not long after. I turned to my wife and said, "I know you're awake." She opened her eyes and looked at me. The anesthesia should have worn off by then, which means she must have been in pain. Despite that, she was able to fake being asleep when her parents were there. I asked her about her tattoo. "Who is, It's obviously not me." She didn't answer me. The H was for my wife's name. I had no idea who the S was for. She seemed like she had no intention of answering my question. "Your mother thinks I did something to ruin our marriage. I refuse to get a divorce until she understands what's really going on. I'm going to tell her about your tattoo and let you figure out what to tell her. The only way I'll agree to a divorce is for your family to know you caused all of this. Not me." My wife started crying her eyes out. She begged me not to talk with her family. She said she'd tell me the truth. She told me that before we started to live apart, she met another man. The issue was with who the man was and how she met him. It was actually someone my good friend, who I had just gone out with the night before, knew. He was a successful businessman that my friend was acquaintances with. Of course, my friend would never have introduced them if he knew what was going to happen. He didn't introduce her to his friend with intentions for her to have an affair. One night, my wife was at the same restaurant as them by chance. When she went up to say hello to my friend, he introduced her to the other guy. They didn't start the affair right away. At first, they were meeting each other just as friends. However, each time they met, she couldn't help but start to get attracted to him. He was successful, and he was kind to her. On the other hand, she hated every interaction she had with me and despised our marriage. Once we started living apart, she started meeting him more and more. She told me she'd be getting money from him every time they met. Not only that, she was getting way more money from him than what I was sending to her. My blood was boiling listening to her. Now that I was out of the house and out of the picture, their affair started. They both knew they couldn't turn back after their affair started. They were doing irreversible damage. The night their affair had started, the businessman told her, "We should both get tattoos." At first, my wife refused. The businessman insisted, saying, "You don't love me." "If you do, prove it." He said that if she got a tattoo of his name, it would force her to divorce me and they could be together. She still didn't feel right about it, but agreed anyway. That night, they went to a tattoo parlor and both got the same tattoo together. I had no idea what to say after she told me that. I stared down at the floor in silence. I worked, and worked and worked and spent every waking minute of my life trying to support her and raise a family. I felt like I was drifting away in the open ocean. She told me about what really happened to cause her accident. She was on her way home after meeting him. She was texting and driving and got hit after she blew a red light. Now I knew everything. Now I had a reason to finally divorce her. Luckily, I had been recording that whole conversation. It was my only insurance against her trying to change her story or blame me for being the cause of the divorce. I had to switch out of husband mode and back into doctor mode. I treated my wife as if she were any other patient. She was eventually released from the hospital. The next day, I met my friend. I confronted him about what my wife had told me. I asked him if he knew what was going on with her and his friend. He started to tremble after I asked him. I knew immediately. He said that he thought they might have been meeting each other after he introduced them. He said he never intended for them to start having an affair. He apologized profusely. When I asked him why he didn't tell me about this sooner, he said he was worried about how I would take it. He told me he had an idea that they were getting close and maybe something was going on. He thought it would be too much for me to handle, so he kept quiet about it. I punched him right in his face. "What kind of friend are you? How could you keep quiet about this?" I screamed at him. Blood and tears were pouring out of his face. He grabbed my leg from the ground, begging me to forgive him. We were two men in our 50s fighting on the floor of a classy cocktail bar. The waiters came to try and break it up. Everyone in the bar was staring at us. I didn't care at all who was watching. My friend was apologizing from the bottom of his heart, saying that he made a huge mistake, and he should have realized things would turn out like this. He took the blame for all of it. To try and make up for what he did, he gave me the businessman's number. I was going to ask him what kind of a low-life piece of garbage steals another man's wife the way he did. My heart was slamming against my chest as I dialed the phone. "This is Hannah's husband. Am I talking to the scumbag who is trying to force a divorce so you can marry my wife? I hope you have a good lawyer because I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth." He was flustered and tried to say, I had the wrong number. He hung up on me. I recorded our short conversation. What a coward. I thought he'd at least be man enough to stay on the phone with me to talk. He sounded scared for his life. This was the guy my wife was going to leave me for. How pathetic. A few minutes later, I got a text. It was from him. "Don't call or text me again. If you do, I'll report you to the police for harassment." He didn't want to face what he did. He was a homewrecker and a coward trying to run away from reality. What a little worm! That text message was what sent me over the edge. I went straight to my wife's mother and father to tell them what was happening. I needed to let them know what kind of person their daughter really was. At the very least, I wanted them to know I wasn't the reason for why we'd be getting a divorce. I told her mother everything. "I'm not the reason why this divorce is happening." "She is. I'm absolutely not going to pay a dime in the divorce settlement." "She already has all the divorce papers ready. She showed me the other day. All I have to do is sign and it'll all be over. Let Hannah know once she gets better." I said what I had to. I waited for her to respond. I thought she was going to start breathing fire. She was enraged. She was furious at her daughter for her behavior and for lying about me being the reason for divorce. Her father said he had a request from one man to another. "Please, just let this all slide. Just this once." I was prepared to hear that. Let it slide. "I've single-handedly pulled your family out of trouble over the years. I don't want to think about all the money I've wasted to fix your mistakes. Never once did I hear thank you for any of it. I can see right through you. You're scared, aren't you? Your bank is finally closing and you're out of luck the next time you inevitably get yourselves into a mess. This is the end of the road. I'm done. I've selflessly helped you time and time again. Those days are over. I don't want anything to do with any of you anymore. I've been waiting to say that for years. It was a huge weight off my shoulders. We got divorced not long after. I got custody of Kendall due to my income and financial stability. Kendall was old enough to know what was going on. She figured out that her mother was having an affair long before I knew. I was worried about what kind of effect this would have on her. She was at a very impressionable age. Luckily, though, she seems to be doing fine. She's enjoying school and goes to see her friends often. In fact, she even plays the role of a mother in the house. She sometimes makes me dinner when I get back from the hospital late. She's studying hard at school and showing me that she's a stand-up kid. I'm so incredibly proud of her. My now ex-wife contacts me every once in a while. Other than the times we have to see each other when she comes to pick up Kendall for the weekend, she says she wants to see me more. Of course, I strictly refused. I think she really was in love with me at some point. After our divorce, it hit her. She selfishly lost everything she had. I'd be lying if I said I didn't love her at one point too. I thought maybe it wouldn't hurt to meet up with her once to see what she had to say. Just kidding. That was never going to happen. If she died, I wouldn't feel any emotion. I couldn't possibly care less about what she had to say or anything about her. I didn't know what her life was like now, and I absolutely didn't care. One thing I did hear from my friend, though, was about the coward businessman. I heard his company went under and now he's unemployed. That's a fitting ending for that dirtbag. What goes around comes around. If he didn't believe in karma before, I bet he does now. Don't get me wrong. I'm not an angel. Never have been. I've tried my best to treat others right, though. I never want to hurt anyone the way I was. I'm waiting for the day my good karma comes back my way. Until then, I'll try my best to be a good father to my daughter and live an honest life with her. Thank you very much for listening to the end. Leave a comment if you liked my story and learned something from it.